Hey, what's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here at Trade Athletics, and today I want to cover some of the things that I really do believe that old school conventional pitching wisdom and old school coaches got right. There's this kind of idea in the new school pitching realm, especially with younger, more inexperienced pitching coaches or analytics guys in this day and age, that old school pitching philosophy can kind of be totally discounted. It's totally obsolete, and guys who've come from an earlier era really should be discounted. They just aren't up to speed. If they don't know how to read a TrackMan report or they don't know how to use an Editronic, that their information, their conventional wisdom is kind of all garbage. Now, my point here is to kind of figure out how can we pick apart some of the things that they actually really did get right from back in the day versus some of the things where maybe they're a little bit outdated. So I really like the Bruce Lee quote here of adapt what is useful, reject what is useless, and add what is uniquely your own. So when I go through and I look at some conventional pitching wisdom or talk to older school pitching coaches, they did not get everything wrong. Like, there's a reason that there are Hall of Famers that emerged, and guys who emerged throwing upper 90s, 100 miles an hour 30, 40, 50 years ago, despite maybe not having as advanced of training methods as we do today. So we're gonna go ahead, we're gonna break down 5 of the different ways that I believe old school pitching coaches or old school conventional pitching wisdom really did get it right and really was ahead of its time. So the first one is that they understood this importance of rhythm, of being smooth, of being fluid. And this is most evident in the fact that most pitchers used an old school windup. And so when we're talking about the old school windup, we're talking about using a little bit of momentum, rhythm, having a big high leg kick, not presetting anything, not doing all your throwing out of the stretch, hands over the head. I've talked about this a ton. I really love the hands over the head cue and just throwing out of the windup in general, even if it's not what you end up doing in the game. Doing it at some point in maybe your drill work, in your bullpens, to at least give you this feeling of how does the lower half connect to the upper half, connect to the trunk, how does everything flow together as one comprehensive unit versus everything is so rigid, so tight, so condensed. There's been this kind of shift back on the pendulum towards simple is always better, and towards the windup, it's just too many moving parts, and so that just must inherently be a less beneficial way to throw. But what I've personally found is that despite it looking like more moving parts, it allows your body to kind of interpret how all these pieces fit together versus doing everything in kind of this piecemeal approach where you're presetting, you're just throwing out of the stretch, maybe you're presetting the hands in a certain spot or you're shortening the arm action. A lot of these Hall of Fame pitchers, I'm thinking of like a Bob Gibson, they had a lot of moving parts, but they were able to understand where their body was in space and it flowed together as one continuous motion where there weren't lags, hitches, and it wasn't always just trying to be as simple as possible with their movements. So they understood this idea of rhythm, timing, sequencing, and being smooth. And so I think bringing back this old school windup, hands over the head, that's something that they did get right and that we've begun to incorporate more into our training. So the next thing that I think that old school pitching coaches or old school conventional pitching wisdom got right is higher frequency mound work, just getting off the mound more regularly throughout the week, throughout the season, throughout the year, and actually doing more of your throwing to an actual catcher, to a human, to a partner, versus doing your throwing maybe purely with plyometric balls or doing a lot more throwing into a net or into a wall, or maybe it's in the off season and you're doing long toss on your own into a net indoors. There's been a shift away from doing exclusively all of your throwing to a real person and off the mound for a lot of it to just more isolated throwing on your own. Now, it's certainly very easy to program an athlete or for an athlete himself to do throwing on his own, right? You don't need to go through the inconvenience of finding a partner, but there's a lot less value in that, in my experience. It doesn't mean that a certain percentage of your throwing can't be done. Maybe your warm-up does incorporate plyos, but I have seen a lot of guys get away from actually just every single day or 4, 5, 6 days a week, just getting out there and actually playing catch, long tossing, regularly throwing bullpens or short boxes to a real person. It's not the same throwing to a command trainer. It's not the same throwing into a net. You start to see some really funky things happen when you get away from the actual skill aspect of just throwing to a person over time. And so we will constantly reiterate to our guys, especially if they're training on their own or they're in a cold climate in the off season, find a way to throw to a person, find a way to get off the mound more regularly once you do ramp up and actually get off the mound. So again, it's something that I think old school pitching coaches got right. Get off the mound regularly, get comfortable with the actual skill of your sport, throwing to a catcher from a downhill slope from 60 feet, 6 inches. And so that's the second thing that I think they got right. So the third thing that I think old school pitchers got right is that they threw a lot. And so they had built up very, very high workloads. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that every pitcher needs to go out there and try to throw complete games every single outing, right? We know that there is definitely a link between excessively high pitch counts and injury risk, but there is also something to be said for properly preparing your tissues to higher throwing workloads. So throwing regularly 5, 6, 7 days a week, gradually building up to that, throwing throughout the majority of the year with certain kind of planned rest periods. Pitchers back in the day threw more by and large, and they also weren't doing exclusively max effort throwing. So they were out there playing catch most days, they were throwing a lot, and their arms were built up and accustomed to these higher workloads. They also followed what I would consider auto-regulation and periodization. So now we have fancy terms for it. What is auto-regulation? Well, I think this is one of the most important things that we can take away from what old school pitchers did, and it basically boils down to they listened to their arms. So maybe on a given day they were a little bit sore, so they threw a little bit lighter, didn't go out as far. On another day, maybe their arm felt really fresh, so maybe they worked out a little bit further, more pitches, maybe they spun a few more breaking balls. Again, it just comes down to listening to your arm, and that's really naturally how we are programmed. And so when it comes to, let's say, the strength training setting, they've done studies where they've compared kind of preset programs and volumes and workloads to auto-regulation based programs, where it's, if you're feeling really good, you do a little bit more volume. If you're feeling under recovered, you do a little bit less. The auto-regulation based programs actually perform better. And it's completely intuitive and it makes sense when you think about it. Your recovery is going to be fluctuating. And so some days you can do a little bit more, some days you can do a little bit less. But going based off of how they feel and how they were recovering is just a natural and intuitive thing that we've really gotten away from. At least certain players have gotten away from that aspect of it. And then from a periodization standpoint, there's a lot of fancy ways to, undulate volume and intensity and workload for throwing, for lifting now. Back in the day when, it got to be too cold outside to throw, guys would just shut down and not throw. And so there were naturally some built-in periods of lower volume, of less throwing or no throwing, 30, 40, 50 years ago, where they didn't necessarily have to have this like pre-programmed deload period from throwing. It was just naturally programmed into their overall yearly workload as it got too cold to throw outside or as the season was over. And so over the course of the year, their program was periodized. As they started to get back into throwing, maybe they threw a little bit less early on, started to build up, started to get comfortable, started to throw a little bit more aggressively, then get off the mound, and obviously built up over the course of the season. And then there were shutdown periods that were just kind of mandatory and forced as a result of the season being over and a result of it being cold outside. So just kind of naturally going through that process, you had a lot of these aspects that we now have come to learn and come to understand are valuable from a programming standpoint. The fourth thing that I think old school pitchers and old school pitching coaches got right is this focus on the importance of feel. Now, when I say feel, some of this was kind of forced, right? We didn't have the technology 50 years ago to measure all these pitch metrics. We didn't have reliable radar guns. We didn't have the ability to do, detailed video analysis. And so some of this was forced because pitchers didn't have the tools to go and hyper-analyze every single thing about their pitching. What did they have to focus on? Well, they had to focus on kind of this internal feel and what was going on intuitively in their bodies. What was going on intuitively with the way that pitch came off their fingers, or the way they actually saw the pitch move, or the way that they saw the hitter actually respond to that pitch or that sequencing. And so this is going to get into a further point on the art of pitching, but they weren't over-reliant on these external tools. They weren't over-reliant on these tools and therefore becoming really, really internally focused on exactly what their body was doing from a positioning standpoint. They weren't worried about like where their arm was in space or what their front foot was doing on video, or if their curveball had 2 inches too little depth on it on that specific rep. And so it allowed them to focus on the feel of their body, the feel of their overall delivery. I've talked about this before, but this is one of the biggest unlocks for me personally in my career. In high school, I was the guy who was super analytical, so I would be like filming every single throw of a session. I'd be doing exactly what I told you guys not to do, which is doing all my throwing by myself to a command trainer or into a net, filming every throw, going over to the camera after every 5 throws, looking at the static positions I was getting into, critiquing what my front leg was doing, and then I would immediately go and try to make a change and try to force my front leg to do something different. And so I basically got really domed up because I was trying to be hyper-reliant on all these external tools. And I get to college and I obviously can't bring, a video camera out to practice. I obviously, have to throw to a human every single day. I'm throwing 6 days a week. and I start to get really in tune with my mechanics, in tune with the feel. It becomes more dominant external focus, and I start to just get really comfortable and in tune with what my mechanics are actually doing. And I gained about 10 miles an hour from freshman year of college to senior year of college and to ultimately getting drafted without using video analysis. We didn't have Rapsodo or TrackMan when I was in college. We didn't have a lot of these tools, and it was really just focused on the external feedback of playing catch, seeing the flight of the ball, how easily did that ball come out of my hand, what did that specific pitch do, what did that slider do, what did that fastball do, did it run, did it cut, did it carry, and just becoming really in tune with what my body was actually doing. So for me, the biggest takeaway here is it's not that we shouldn't be using some of these more advanced tools and learning how they work, especially from a coach's perspective. It's just from an athlete's perspective, you need to be really careful with becoming over-reliant on them and how much of the information do the athletes actually need to know versus how much of it is kind of nice to know at times or only on an as-needed basis. So I've coached certain athletes where they can handle a ton of information thrown at them, and then when they're able to get in the game, get on the mound, none of it affects them. They can execute, they can perform. Other athletes, it just cripples them mentally. They have so much going on in their head. They're worrying about the pitch metrics. They're worrying about what their lead leg is doing. And it starts to be really detrimental and counterproductive. And we try to get away from the technology and worry about the actual feel of what's going on and get them to be in tune with their mechanics again. So feel, I would say, is one of the most important lessons we can take away from old school pitchers, because they were just forced into becoming reliant on that. And then the fifth thing that I think old school pitching coaches got right in one sense is there was really a focus on the art of pitching versus on pure velocity. Now, it's certainly on a little bit of a spectrum, right? You need to understand that not only is pitch movement and pitch execution and throwing strikes, command, right? This is clearly an important side of the equation, but velocity ultimately does matter as well. Back in the day, there weren't reliable radar guns, or there weren't radar guns, depending how far back you go. And so just as a result of that, people didn't value velocity as much because you really just couldn't tell the difference between a 90 mile an hour fastball and a 92 mile an hour fastball. Like, people didn't know, scouts didn't know. Could they tell with their eyes and visually, and could the hitters tell if it was 85 versus 95? Like, people knew that Koufax was throwing harder than everybody else. People knew that Bob Gibson was throwing harder than everybody else, or Nolan Ryan, but they couldn't tell you exactly how much harder they were throwing than everybody else. And so the value placed on velocity was just a little bit less because we couldn't reliably measure it. As soon as radar guns, became mainstream and came out, suddenly we kind of got into this velocity-obsessed era as a result. And for good reason, velocity does matter. So I'm not saying that we need to be all on one extreme or the other, but this idea that pitch movement matters, this idea that execution matters, has very much continued to be true, and all the data analytics continue to show that to be true, right? If we go and look at Greg Maddux, we go and look at his fastball profile, we don't have the metrics on that. We can see, he has clearly over 20 plus inches of horizontal movement on some of these sinkers that he's throwing, plus movement, plus execution and location. And so that is a huge piece of the equation that we can't ignore, that a lot of pitching coaches who are a little bit older school, maybe they focus too far on that side of the equation, but a lot of these new school pitching coaches won't focus on that side nearly enough. And so there needs to be a blend of both, knowing at what times of the year maybe do we need to focus on velocity and stuff, and at what times of the year do we maybe need to focus on movement, on execution, on the actual performance side of the equation. And so I think we can find a happy medium between those two things. It's worth noting that even old school pitchers, so even going back 30, 40, 50, 60 years, there were pitchers that were ahead of their time from a training standpoint. And a lot of these pitchers were the guys that really excelled from a velocity standpoint. These were the hard throwers of their era. So when I go back and I look at what Nolan Ryan did, or guys like Tom Seaver or Bob Gibson, right? These guys focused on things a little bit differently than what was kind of conventional at the time. So Nolan Ryan was a guy who was known for long toss. He was also known for strength training. He was also known for some weighted ball stuff. So he would go out and he would long toss a softball and a baseball as far as he could. What is a softball? A softball is a weighted implement. It's heavier than a baseball. He was out there long tossing max distance before that was really accepted, before the whole, Alan Jaeger long toss type movement from the past 10, 20 years. He was out there already doing that. He was grunting. He was throwing things as hard as he could before that was really accepted and kind of the norm now at this point. Bob Gibson, same thing. He was out there grunting. He was out there throwing things as hard as he could. He was out there competing his ass off, and he was out there not worrying about fielding positions, just being athletic, being smooth, being explosive, and trying to throw the ball through the catcher's face mask. And so there were these guys that were way ahead of their time. Tom Seaver, known for being really into weightlifting, really into strength training before it was popular, when everyone thought that it would just make you muscle bound and tight and it was not performance enhancing for pitchers. So it's worth noting, like even going back, there were some guys that went against the grain and began to discover some of the things that we now know are really beneficial from a velocity standpoint. So to end this video, I really just wanted to hammer home the point that old school does not necessarily equal bad. There's a crop of young coaches, especially coaches without a ton of experience, that know how to, again, work in the Edgertronic, read a TrackMan report, and kind of look down on this whole old school movement, old school coaches, and there's just really a rift between those two sides. So the point of this is to kind of bring both sides together, recognize there still is a lot of value to what old school pitching coaches figured out and realized, and while they can get up to speed with some of the new school technology and how does that apply, I think a lot of these newer school analytically minded coaches can also learn from kind of the art side of pitching, the smoothness, the rhythm, the fluidity, the higher volumes and workloads, intelligently ramped up to obviously the periodization and auto-regulation, listening to the arm, and how do we incorporate some of these old school things into the new school training. That's really the point I wanted to hammer home and start that conversation. Thanks a lot guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.